Welcome to the Cincinnati Observatory. We'd like to conduct a historical tour for you today. Our storyline begins about 1809 on the banks of the Ohio, a little bit south of Louisville, Kentucky. A young boy was born, Ormsby McKnight Mitchell. Very unusual name. I've never met anybody named Ormsby before. Unfortunately, he was only about 3. His father died of the rigors of wilderness, very rough life for the family back then. Mother could not afford to keep the family up, a very large family. So she relocated the family up to the Cincinnati area and then moved to Lebanon, Ohio. And you might recognize that as the home of the Golden Lamb restaurant, the oldest inn in Ohio. Well, upstairs of the Golden Lamb are various rooms you can eat in or sleep in. And all the rooms are named for the famous people. And of course, one of the rooms is named for the hero of our story, Ormsby McKnight Mitchell. Another room is named for the gentleman in the portrait right behind me. We'll get to him in a few minutes. As Ormsby was growing up in Lebanon, he was essentially what we call today homeschooled by his much older brothers. He reached the age of about 12 or 13. And at that age, he was truly an exceptionally fine young man, was an expert at mathematics, could read and write many of the foreign languages, including Latin and Greek. And at that age, 12 or 13, he declared himself to be independent, left home to support himself working as a clerk in another city, and add financial support back to his family. By the time he was 15, he had heard that he could get paid for going to school. He loved education. And the school was West Point, the premier academic institution in the country. At that time, he was the youngest man to get appointed to West Point. He was still only 15 years old. But he could not afford the stagecoach ride to go 700 miles from Cincinnati to New York to get into West Point. So he essentially walked to the East Coast to get into West Point. He used some of the canals on his way up to West Point. The year that Ormsby got to West Point was 1825. And that was the same year that this gentleman, President number 6, John Quincy Adams, was starting his presidency. But before he was president, among many other services to the country, he was our country's first minister. Today we would use the word ambassador to Alexander I, Tsar of Russia, who had the world's largest telescope, was an expert at astronomy, and taught John Quincy astronomy. Quincy had a passion for astronomy the rest of his life. Every day in his diary, he would record what we see in the sky naked eye or with his handheld telescope. The same year that Mitchell got to West Point, 1825, John Quincy became president. At his inaugural address, his challenge to Congress, he challenged Congress to build the country's first national observatory. He failed in his attempt. One of the reasons he failed was that the state rightist movement was quite strong at that time. They did not want to give money or power to the federal government, and the National Observatory would have been under the federal government. They want to keep everything at state level control, almost the opposite as we have in our political situation today. In America, we essentially had no professional observatories. Europe and Russia had over 130 operating observatories. When Ormsby McKnight Mitchell graduated from West Point 4 years later, he was so good at mathematics, he became an assistant professor at West Point teaching mathematics. Then eventually he surrendered his commission, returned to the city of Cincinnati, where he taught himself law, but unfortunately he couldn't find any clients. That did not work out well for him. Then he started surveying because he was trained as a surveyor at West Point, and his father was a surveyor. He surveyed the first railroad coming into the Cincinnati, the Miami Railroad. If you know where the Loveland Bike Trail is, that's the path of the old Miami Railroad. He had a major hand in any railroad coming in or out of the city until he eventually died of yellow fever in the Civil War. Our storyline now goes up to 1842, and in Cincinnati, population approximately 50,000. According to some statistics, the 4th largest city in the country at the time. There was a group of people called the Society for the Promotion of Useful Knowledge. And I think we need to resurrect that society again in our own environment. It was a self-help organization, and they offered Mitchell the opportunity to lecture to the citizens. He started his lecture in his lecture hall, overflowed that. Then they moved the lecture to the Wesley Chapel, which seated 1,200 people. It was on 5th Street, right where Procter & Gamble's garden is today. Overflowed that. And at the end of the lecture series, we suspect, prompted by Mitchell, they essentially said, well, why could we not, the citizens of Cincinnati, do something for the country that President John attempted to do previously, and then start the country's first significant observatory. The citizens decided to start the Cincinnati Astronomical Society. Here is their charter and constitution from 1842. Now, since Mitchell was selling stock for the railroads, he suggested let's selling shares, meaning stock, to become a member in the Astronomical Society. $25 a share to become a member. Well, that was a significant sum at that time. That was equivalent to 2 or 3 months' salary for a laborer at that particular period. Yet, surprisingly, within only 3 weeks, over 300 people raised their hand and said wanted to be a part of the society. We now have their names inscribed on the original charter in the left column, center column, and right column. It's actually a litany of who's who of old Cincinnati. And by the time the telescope arrived a few years later, there were over 700 members in the society. And we believe this is the first time that selling shares for membership was used to found a private or a public institution. So with his funds, he went to Europe to acquire a telescope. They didn't make telescopes of significant size in America at that time. He eventually ending up in Munich, Bavaria in 1842. He stopped at the house of Merz and Mahler, and then got the second or third largest telescope in the world. The Tsar of Russia had the largest. At that time, it was just a lens that was hand ground. He had it tested. It was a perfect lens. He said, that's what we want for the Cincinnati telescope. It took 3 years to 1845 to complete the telescope, ship it across the Atlantic Ocean to New Orleans, up the Mississippi River, up the Ohio River, and it in Cincinnati, April 1845. Well, between 1842, when he got back from Europe in 1845, Mitchell was responsible for designing and building the observatory. So the president of the society at the time was Judge Jacob Burnett, from Burnett Woods fame. And Mitchell decided to invite the now ex-president, the former president, John Quincy Adams, to town to lay the cornerstone of the observatory. Quincy was in the House of Representatives, 76 years old, not in good health. His family did not want to come to town. We have a handwritten letter by John Quincy Adams displayed at the observatory, where he essentially is saying, I'm on my way. If I'm delayed, it's not my fault. But what we don't have displayed, and probably should, is what he put into his diary. He said, I'd rather be known as a man who came to Cincinnati to lay the cornerstone of the first observatory than for being president of this great land. John Quincy eagerly accepted the invitation to come to town. It took him 2 weeks to get here. He was staying with his son in Boston. He used one of those newfangled devices of the day called a railroad from Boston to Lake Erie, a steamship across Lake Erie to Cleveland, a canal packet from Cleveland to Columbus, Ohio, and then a stagecoach from Columbus to Cincinnati. Each night he stayed over at some place. The last night he stayed over at the Golden Lamb restaurant, and that's why they have a room upstairs of the Golden Lamb restaurant named for the John Quincy Adams room. On November 9, 1843, was the ceremony date for Adams to lay the cornerstone. The city shut down for a day. A parade over a mile long over 6th Street up this hill east of downtown called Mount Ida. Allegedly, it was called Mount Ida because there was an old woman named Ida who lived on the hill. She used to do the wash for the soldiers in Fort Washington along 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Street. And according to legend, she lived in the trunk of a huge old sycamore tree. Quaint story, but evidently a true story. Unfortunately, this day, it was a horrible rainy day. And as the citizens were marching up this muddy hill to the top of Mount Ida, it was so bad that President Adams just gave a very, very short dedication speech, but repeated his lecture the next day in the Wesley Chapel, the same chapel that Mitchell started the Astronomical Society in a few years prior, which seated 1,200 people, but this day 3,000 people squeezed in to hear him give the talk. Mount Ida became Mount Adams because the next day the city renamed the hill Mount Adams in his honor. Here's an old photograph of the area of the particular period where Mount Adams was shown literally on top of the hill there. And then the telescope that was erected into the observatory is shown in this photograph right here. This is the length of the tube of the telescope. The lens end is at the top. There's Professor Mitchell at the bottom of the telescope using the eyepiece. Then the telescope is mounted on a stone pier. Then the main axle of the telescope, or the polar axle, points up to the North Celestial Pole, where the star Polaris is. As soon as the telescope was erected into the observatory, Mitchell started using it, and he did just great astronomical work. But the city of Cincinnati was becoming industrialized, doubling in size in about every 10 years. And then to heat and fuel it, they started burning soft coal instead of wood. And the byproduct of that soft coal was thick, black, sooty, yucky smoke. In very short order of time, the basin of the city in Mount Adams became useless as an astronomical site because of the smoke pollution. You also had 30 and 40 paddle wheel boats lined up on the Ohio River right on the foot of Mount Adams, belching out smoke of this smokestack. By the 1870s, the smoke pollution downtown was so bad that the board of directors of the Astronomical Society decided they were going to close the observatory, and they also thought at the same time that a city of our size should have a university. So they decided to start the University of Cincinnati. If you look at the last board of directors of the Astronomical Society, and at this time the president of the society was Alphonso Taft, father of President Taft, and the board of directors at the University of Cincinnati, many of them were the same individuals, or they were friends or colleagues of one another when the university started. So they decided to close the observatory on top of Mount Adams and then move the observatory to a new site under the auspices of the university in an area that was named Mount Lookout, about 5 miles east of downtown Cincinnati. Behind me is the building they decided to build. It was built in 1873, designed by architect Samuel Hannaford, and this is the first significant building he designed other than some homes. The building cost $30,000, and John Kilgore, one of the board members, was very influential in funding that. He paid $10,000 for the building. He donated the flat 4 acres upon which we're standing. Then his son, Bayard Kilgore, several years later, donated 10 additional acres, so there was eventually 14 acres on campus at the new society in Mount Lookout. By 1904, the director of the observatory, at this time it was Germain Gildersleeve Porter, decided to acquire a new telescope, a 16-inch diameter Alvan Clark refracting telescope. So the original telescope that Mitchell acquired then was removed from the Mount Lookout building, the observatory, and then put into this building right behind me, the 1904 building. In 1904, it was just a round observatory, very small lobby, and then a few years later, definitely by 1912, they added the wings of the building. When the telescope was moved from Mount Adams to Mount Lookout, the only item of the old observatory that was moved into the new site was a cornerstone that John Quincy laid in 1843. On one face, to the left face, was the original inscription, Cincinnati Astronomical Society, founded May Anno Domini 1842. And then when they went to the new Mount Lookout building, they inscribed the second face of the building. This cornerstone was laid by John Quincy Adams, November 9, 1843, removed and relaid, and then in Roman numerals, 1873. We're now going to go into the smaller of the 2 observatory buildings, the Mitchell building, which houses the original telescope that Mitchell purchased in 1842. Well, this is our pride and joy telescope, the oldest public, some people say professional telescope in America. Purchased in 1842, arrived in Cincinnati 1845. Then when it went on to Mount Adams, then in the 1870s it came out to this site in the other building, and then moved into this building, the Mitchell building, the smaller of the two observatory buildings, in 1904. Telescope is made with wooden tube, Brazilian mahogany. This observatory has a dome on top of us. The dome is to protect the telescope from the elements and the people who have to work here. But then the light from the moon or stars, whatever we're looking at that particular night, comes through the dome slit that we just opened, and then goes into the lens of the telescope at the top of the tube. Where the lens acts as a prism, bending the light. The light is bent into the shape of a cone, like an ice cream cone of light, coming all the way down the tube, getting skinnier and skinnier, until you come to about where the tip of my thumb is. A virtual image is formed or produced of the object we're seeing in the sky, but the image is very, very, very small. Now you need to magnify that small image, and we use a fancy magnifying glass we call an eyepiece or an ocular. Each eyepiece or ocular magnifies a different amount. So we put the eyepiece into the eyepiece holder, and then we can magnify the object we see in the sky. Well, to use the telescope, you just literally grab it, aim it, and point it at the particular object you see in the sky. You sort of shotgun over the top of the tube, get it close to the object, and then you bring your eye to this brass telescope on the side called a finding telescope. It gives you a very wide field view of the sky, very low magnification, and down where the eyepiece of the tube is, there's a crosshairs. So you put the center of the crosshair in the center of the object you see in the sky. Then when you bring your eye to the main telescope, looking through the eyepiece magnified, the object is in the field of view, highly magnified, very, very beautiful. Now the telescope is mounted on this pier, a cast iron pier. The pier goes down into the basement on a pile of rocks, down to bedrock, so it's solidly mounted on the earth. Well, we are riding on the earth, a big ball, a big globe. We are rolling in this direction, which is east, about 750 miles an hour. We can't quite perceive how fast we're going, but that's how fast we're going. It wasn't until about the 1950s when an electric motor was installed to replace the mechanical drive system. We have plans eventually on replacing the electric motor with the original restored mechanical drive. Everything had to operate mechanically, including using this bull rope and pulley to open up the shutter. So to open up the shutter, you just pull down on the bull rope and pulley, and the shutter very easily slides open. Well, once we have the shutter open, because the object in the sky is drifting typically from east through south to west across the sky, we have to move or reposition the shutter to keep up with the object as it moves across the sky. There's no motors, no electricity here in 1904, so we had to use a mechanical device called a crank. And we have a crank here on the wall, and the astronomers or the people who assisted the astronomers would put their hands on the crank, and just by turning the crank, the whole dome turns. You can go either direction, one-handed, very, very easy to do. You're turning tons and tons of sheet metal up there. After looking at the Mitchell telescope, we're now going to return to the 1873 building, the original building on the Mount Lookout site, to look at the new telescope, the 1904 Alvin Clark and Sons. After Ormsby McKnight Mitchell died of yellow fever in the Civil War, the president of the Cincinnati Astronomical Society, Alphonso Taft, father of President Taft, and the other board members brought in a second astronomer, and he brought in this gentleman, Cleveland Abbey. As soon as Abbey came to town, he experienced the same problem as Mitchell, that is smoke pollution from the burning soft coal downtown, produced thick black sooty smoke. You could not do astronomy on top of Mount Adams. So Cleveland had another idea. He had an interest in meteorology, and by this time the country had stretched telegraph lines out at least as far as Denver. He would correspond telegraphically with all the major cities in the country, essentially asking, "What is your weather?" And from the telegraph reply, he noticed there was a pattern. What the weather was in one area of the country west turned out to be the area of country's east weather the next day. Therefore, Cleveland Abbey is what we call the father of American weather prediction. President Grant heard what he was doing. He liked the idea. He thought that would be a secret tool to be able to predict weather in war. Wars were going on after the Civil War. So he was, Grant then transferred Abbey up to Washington, D.C., where he reported to the Department of the Army Signal Corps. Wars weren't going on at the time, so while he was still officially associated with the observatory, he founded the National Weather Service. This is our new telescope, the 1904 Alvin Clark and Sons. The astronomers wanted a newer, bigger, better telescope, so they acquired this one, and it was installed in the original building that was purchased or built in 1873. To assist the astronomer, they would hire a teenager. Teenager would be paid 25 cents a night to work all night for the astronomer. Teenager would have 3 jobs. The first job is to walk over to the bull rope and pulley and pull on the bull rope to open up the shutter to let the light from the moon or stars enter into the observatory dome. The second job the teenager had was to add energy to the telescope to make it work. It functions like a grandfather's clock, where you crank up the weight falls, that's kinetic energy, then the hands of the clock turn around. As the 400-pound weight drops in response to gravity, that's kinetic energy, the energy is transferred by chain up to the clockworks, where you hear the little door open. And if we look into that door, that window, we see the gears are turning of the telescope. And on top of the clockworks, there is a governor. The governor has vanes and paddles on it, moving in and out, governing the speed of the telescope very precisely. Then the energy is transferred to the small gears on the bottom of the left of the door, which then transfers up the energy up the long shaft to the top of the pier, where other gears turn. Then the big 32-inch gear turns. Then the main axle of the telescope turns, and that axle is parallel to Earth's axis of rotation. Then eventually the energy is transferred to the big telescope tube, which moves across the sky at the rate of 1 revolution per day in the opposite direction that the Earth is rotating. The third job that the teenager had was to assist the astronomer in turning the big metal dome, the sheet metal dome, which is tons of sheet metal. There was no motors, no electricity here in 1904 when the telescope arrived. So the teenager then would use his crank on the wall, and by turning the crank through various gears and chain mechanism with the gear at the top, the big dome turns. Once you get it off a dead spot, 1 finger is enough to turn this big crank, turning tons of sheet metal. Another job that the teenager had was to assist the astronomer in aiming or pointing the telescope. To do that, you grab this top hand wheel, and by turning the top hand wheel, the whole telescope moves in the north-south direction. So now the telescope lens is pointing north, low on the horizon, as though you're looking at a low-level star. If that's the case, then look at the position where the eyepiece is, well off the floor by 20 or 30 feet. Well, the people visiting the observatory or the astronomers have to get the eye up to the eyepiece. Well, then the teenager will take the astronomer, have him walk up the steep staircase, stand him on the observing platform up there, which is actually an elevator. You can mainly push the elevator up and down. There's counterweights in the back, very easy to do, so that the eye of the astronomer is lined with the eyepiece, wherever the eyepiece happens to be positioned in the room. We're now going to go into the west wing of the Hergert building, the original 1873 building, to see where we had another observatory with a very special telescope called a meridian circle. This is a meridian circle telescope, and it was in this room from about the 1887 forward. And to make it operate, an astronomer would be on a couch that would roll on the rails on the floor, his eye at the eyepiece of the telescope. And then as he would sight on the various stars through the sky with the open slit, a different astronomer would read the time of the observation and the address of the observation, and they would take those values to the office the next day and do manual, longhand, 11-place logarithmic calculations to determine basic positions of the stars. Well, the telescope then was mounted on this pier that is in the middle of the floor. It's actually a top of a pier which goes down to bedrock. And then the telescope then would point to the slit in the sky. It's about 1 foot wide, so the astronomers could see horizon to horizon on the north-south meridian line. and that's a part in the sky where the stars get highest in the sky. Well, this is one of our clocks at the observatory, one of our 4 principal clocks. It's a James Ritchie, which was acquired from England in Edinburgh. And when we did the restorations of the observatory, we had the world's #1 clock repair person come over from England, and he spent a couple years restoring our 4 principal clocks. Well, our clocks have weights and pendulums, and the weights and pendulums are filled with mercury. That was a standard of the day. But this is a 1-week clock, so we have to crank up the weight. And to crank up the weight, you open up the door, use a manual crank, put it into the crank hole. And then by turning the crank, the weight goes up. Then it takes a whole week for the weight to fall down. We're all set for another week.
I hope you enjoyed John's presentation on the history of the Cincinnati Observatory. The observatory is a National Historic Landmark that was founded on and continues to exist on contributions from citizens and visitors. We function today through the generous gift of time from our many volunteers and friends of the observatory members. Financial contributions are also needed and are tax deductible. We appreciate your gift of time, talent, and treasure to preserve this historical and scientific treasure for generations to come. Thank you.